I never expected an ordinary afternoon at school to become the kind of memory that lingers, reshaping everything I thought I knew. It began like any other day, routine, predictable, but quickly became something else entirely. That day, something changed within me, something I couldn't ignore. Mr. Harris wasn't just another teacher. He had this calm presence about him, a quiet authority that didn't rely on shouting to command attention. He was in his late 30s, with dark hair just beginning to gray at the temples, adding a refined edge to his otherwise youthful demeanor. There was a certain gravity to him, one that made it impossible not to notice him. For a while, I thought my admiration for him was just that, a student respecting a teacher. But as the months passed, I realized it wasn't that simple. I found myself watching him a little too closely, staying after class more often, hoping for fleeting moments where it felt like it was just the two of us. That afternoon, I had stayed late, working on an overdue assignment. The final bell had rung, and the bustling noise of students leaving had faded into silence. The classroom felt peaceful, almost sacred in its emptiness. Mr. Harris sat at his desk, grading papers with an air of focus I envied. I didn't notice him watching me until the quiet became heavy, drawing my attention upward. His gaze was steady, unreadable, and it sent an inexplicable shiver through me. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice as calm and smooth as always. I nodded, my response casual, though my heart had begun to race. I mumbled something about finishing the assignment, and he replied with a compliment about my dedication. His words warm but laced with an intensity one couldn't quite place. His eyes didn't leave mine, lingering just a little too long. For the first time, the silence between us felt charged, like the room itself was shrinking, forcing us closer. I felt self-conscious under his gaze, but I didn't want to look away. That moment marked the start of something I didn't yet understand but couldn't deny. The classroom's silence wrapped around us like a cocoon, isolating us from the rest of the world. The moment felt suspended, stretched thin with the weight of something unspoken. I kept my head down, pretending to work, though my mind was a tangle of thoughts I couldn't untangle. The faint sounds of his movements, papers rustling, the soft scrape of a chair, were amplified in the quiet. I felt his presence more than I saw him. He stood, the deliberate sound of his chair moving, causing my pulse to quicken. My hands gripped my pen tightly, as if the simple act of holding onto something could anchor me to reality. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just a natural awareness of being alone with someone else in an empty room. But it wasn't. When he moved toward the door, I thought the tension would break, that I would hear the familiar click of the door closing behind him, leaving me alone to sort through the strange, restless feelings his presence stirred. But the sound I heard wasn't the door opening. It was the soft, deliberate click of a lock turning. I froze. My head jerked up involuntarily, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. When I looked at him, his expression had shifted. The easy calm he always carried was still there, but now there was something beneath it, something weightier, darker. He walked back slowly, and though his movements were casual, his gaze was anything but. There was an intensity in his eyes that made me feel as though he could see straight through me. The air in the room felt heavier, and the space between us seemed to shrink with every step he took. I felt caught in the moment, as if the world outside had vanished, and all that was left was him, his steady presence, and the inexplicable pull I felt toward him. My breath quickened, my hands damp with sweat as I tried to steady myself. When he reached my desk, he stopped. I didn't move, didn't speak, barely even breathed. My skin tingled with awareness, a sharp contrast to the stillness of my body. He lingered there, his presence close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. It was then that I realized this wasn't just a fleeting moment of tension. There was something else between us, something real and dangerous that neither of us was ready to name. His nearness was intoxicating, and though I knew it was wrong, knew it crossed every boundary I had been taught to respect, I couldn't bring myself to break away. Time moved differently in those moments, stretching and compressing all at once. The space around us seemed to warp, pulling us closer into each other's orbit. I felt the charge in the air as surely as if it were a physical thing, pressing against my skin, pulling me into something I didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. When his hand brushed against my arm, it was like a spark igniting a fire I hadn't realized was already burning. The touch was light, almost fleeting, but it lingered, imprinted on my skin long after he pulled away. My pulse raced, my breath hitching in a way I couldn't control. I tried to focus on the desk in front of me, on the scattered papers and half-finished sentences. But all I could feel was his presence. All I could think about was the weight of his gaze, the way the air in the room seemed charged with an unspoken electricity. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying that moment over and over in my mind. It consumed me, the memory of his touch, the way he looked at me, the way the room had seemed to shrink until it felt like it was just the two of us and nothing else. Each time I stayed after class, the tension grew. It wasn't just in my head. I could feel it, tangible and undeniable, in the way he lingered near me, in the way his presence filled the room. My excuses for staying late became thinner, more transparent, but neither of us acknowledged the real reason I couldn't seem to leave. There was a kind of silent understanding between us, one we didn't dare put into words. Words would make it real, would force us to face the implications of what was happening. Instead, we existed in that charged silence, in stolen moments that felt both exhilarating and suffocating. One afternoon, the rain poured down outside, the steady rhythm of it against the windows amplifying the quiet inside the room. I stayed late again, my pen scratching aimlessly against the paper in front of me. The excuses I told myself for being there had long since faded, leaving only the undeniable truth of why I lingered. When I finally looked up, he was watching me again. His gaze wasn't casual or distracted. It was intent, focused, as though he were trying to unravel something in me. I felt stripped bare under the weight of it, vulnerable in a way I wasn't prepared for. He stood and walked toward the door, locking it with a quiet finality. My heart raced, my breath catching in my throat. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around us as he moved back toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. There was no denying what was happening now. The air between us was thick with it, with the weight of everything we hadn't said, everything we had both felt but tried to suppress. The charged silence stretched on, and I found myself leaning into him, as though gravity itself was pulling me closer. The rain against the windows became the only sound in the room, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. Time felt suspended, each second stretching into an eternity as he stood there, impossibly close, his presence filling the room in a way that made it hard to breathe. I was acutely aware of every detail. The faint scent of his cologne, the way his eyes held mine, the warmth radiating from him. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, or maybe it was me, but suddenly the space between us disappeared. His hand brushed against mine, a barely there touch that sent a jolt through me. Every nerve in my body was alive, hyper-aware of him, of the way his presence made the air feel heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. Then his lips were on mine, soft and tentative at first, as if testing the limits of what we could allow ourselves. The kiss was brief, barely a whisper against my skin, but it shattered something inside me. The world outside ceased to exist, and all that remained was him, the heat of his touch, the weight of his gaze. When he pulled back, the silence returned, thick and suffocating. My breath was uneven, my heart pounding as I tried to process what had just happened. But there was no going back now. The line we had crossed couldn't be uncrossed, and we both knew it. In the days that followed, we lived in stolen moments. The glances across the classroom that lingered too long, the accidental brushes of skin that sent shivers through me, the unspoken words that hung heavy in the air between us. Each moment was a secret, a fragile thread tying us together in a way that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. I stayed after class more often, each time under the pretense of needing help with assignments. But it wasn't about the work. It was about him, about the way his presence made me feel alive in a way I hadn't experienced before. One afternoon, as the last student filed out and the sound of footsteps faded down the hall, he locked the door again. The click of the lock sent a shiver through me, a mix of fear and anticipation. When he turned to me, his expression was different, more open, more vulnerable. He crossed the room slowly, his movements deliberate. I stayed where I was, unable to move, unable to look away. When he reached me, his hands rested on my arms, his touch both firm and gentle. I could feel the heat of his skin through my shirt, and it sent a wave of warmth through me, leaving me breathless. The kiss that followed was different this time. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was deeper, more urgent, filled with everything we hadn't said, everything we couldn't say. His hands moved my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, my body responding instinctively to his touch. For a moment, it was easy to forget the risks, the consequences. The world outside didn't matter. Only this did. The intensity of his touch, the way his lips moved against mine, the way his hands explored my skin. All of it consumed me. But reality has a way of creeping back in, no matter how much you want to escape it. When we finally pulled apart, our breaths mingling in the quiet, the weight of what we had done settled over us. His forehead rested against mine, his eyes closed as though he were trying to hold on to the moment just a little longer. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Every glance, every touch, every stolen kiss felt like a secret we couldn't keep. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, the whispers in the hallways growing louder, the looks from other students lingering just a little too long. The first time I overheard someone mention my name in connection to his, my stomach twisted. They didn't know, not really, but the speculation was enough to send a wave of panic through me. If they were noticing, how long would it be before someone put the pieces together? I tried to push the fear aside, to focus on the moments I had with him, but the tension between us, the weight of the secret we shared, grew heavier with each passing day. The stolen moments became more desperate, tinged with a sense of inevitability, as though we were both waiting for the moment it would all come crashing down. It happened on a quiet afternoon. I arrived at his classroom, my heart heavy with the growing fear of what we were risking. When I stepped inside, his expression told me everything I needed to know. They know. The words echoed in my mind, their weight suffocating. I felt my knees weaken, my breath catching in my throat. The world tilted, the reality of what he had said sinking in. Someone had found out. I didn't ask who. It didn't matter. What mattered was what would happen next. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the air between us thick with everything we couldn't say. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, filled with an emotion I couldn't name. I don't know what happens now. Neither did I. The days after his confession blurred together, a haze of fear, regret, and anticipation. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs grew into full-blown rumors. Everywhere I turned, I felt eyes on me, curious and accusatory. The weight of their stares was suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the silence between us. We stopped meeting after class. The stolen moments that had once felt like lifelines now felt like liabilities. Each time I saw him in the hallway, his expression was guarded, his movements distant, as though he were already retreating from whatever fragile connection we had built. The administration acted swiftly. Meetings were called, parents were involved, and I was questioned in a way that made my stomach churn. They wanted the truth, but how could I give it to them? How could I explain something I barely understood myself? When I saw him for what would be the last time, it wasn't in the quiet intimacy of the classroom, but in the cold sterility of a conference room. He sat across from me, the confidence that had always defined him now replaced by exhaustion. His eyes met mine briefly, and in that fleeting moment, I saw everything, regret, pain, and something close to resignation. He didn't speak, and neither did I. There was nothing to say. The decision had already been made. Later that night, I received his message. A single sentence that broke something in me. I'm leaving. I'm sorry. I stared at the words for what felt like hours, the finality of them sinking in like a weight I couldn't shake. He was gone. Just like that, it was over. In the days that followed, the rumors began to fade, replaced by newer scandals, fresher gossip. The world moved on, as it always does, but I couldn't. Every glance at his empty desk, every walk past a classroom that no longer felt like a sanctuary, was a reminder of what I had lost. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The warmth of his touch, the weight of his gaze, the way it made me feel seen, understood, in a way no one else ever had. It was forbidden, wrong in ways I couldn't deny, but it had been real. Even now, I don't know if I would call it love. Maybe it was, or maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, it had changed me. The story ended as it had to, with separation, silence, and the ache of what might have been. But the memory lingers, not as a regret, but as a reminder of how something so fleeting can leave a mark so permanent. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to my channel for more. Thank you for listening.